good afternoon and welcome to this month's IQ Academy webinar. I'm Sarah Fry, the Business Development and Communications Manager here at IQ. These Lunch and Learn webinars were designed to give a short overview on a range of topics aligned to the skills wheel. The webinar itself is recorded and will be made available to all registrants, so look out for that follow-up email to the links to the recording. Today's webinar will be delivered by Dr Carolyn Yeoman of OCAID Wellbeing, and we'll be talking about creating wellbeing. But before we get on to Carolyn's presentation, if you have any questions about today's session, you can send those through on the questions panel to the right of your screen. If we don't get a chance to cover any of those during the time we've got today, we'll ensure that they're addressed in the follow-up emails and materials that are sent out after this webinar event. We also have a short questionnaire that will display at the end of the session today. Please take the time to complete this if you get a chance, as the feedback really helps with the Lunch and Learn webinars in the future when we're planning them. You'll see a list of the branch events that are upcoming. Also, if you want more information about that, go to the IQ web page for events and you'll see the details of them there, or contact your local branch for more information. So without further ado, I think we'll hand over to Dr Carolyn Yeoman to do today's webinar. And thank you, Carolyn, and here you go.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, I'm Carolyn. I'm an organisational psychologist and ops director for OCAID Wellbeing. We work with organisations helping them to create wellbeing for their staff. If anybody's on here expecting me to be talking about bikes and bananas, then I'm really sorry, but you'll be disappointed, because what I'm here to do is to talk about wellbeing in hopefully a different way and in a way in which you've not heard it spoken about before. So often we hear organisations talking about how important their people are, how it's people first, people are the most important asset. You know, our company is our people. So we hear this all the time, and it's in most organisations' visions at some point that people are the most important asset. And yet, despite that, we're still at the point where organisations still don't ensure the health and safety of their staff while at work. So we do safety, but we generally don't do health. So although it's always been health and safety, and the HSE talk about health and safety, we've generally just concentrated on safety. And so there is this move now to start to think more about health as well. And it's something that's at the forefront of the government's mind as well. So, you know, Dame Carol Black has talked about the fact that you can't be a safe worker if you're not a healthy worker. And so I thought it might be interesting just to have a look at some of the statistics that are around regarding sort of well-being, stress at work, that type of thing. And the research that backs up these statistics can be found at the bottom of this particular slide, so you can see where the references are from if you want to look them up any further. But one of the things that we know is that actually healthy workers are 3 times more productive than unhealthy workers. So that's a really, really important statistic in its own right. But we also know that healthy workers are 9 times less likely to take sick leave than unhealthy workers. So potentially we've got people at work, if they're not well, who are being unproductive, and also they're much more likely to take time off work. If we start to look at stress generally, then you can go on the HSE website and find all the sort of relevant statistics, but the big one is that it's on average 3.2 working days per employee per year that's lost due to workplace stress. And we know that this is a massive underestimate, because people don't generally still report that they are suffering from stress. There's still a stigma attached to it. So we believe that this figure is much higher than the figures actually suggest. Another important issue to consider is one of presenteeism, and some of you may have heard of the term, but I know some of you won't. And presenteeism is really where we've got people in work, they're there in body, but they're not there in mind. So they are physically in the workplace, but they're actually not being productive at all, or being much less productive than they would normally. So they may be staring at blank screens, or spending lots of time just going around talking to people, or daydreaming, or, you know, all sorts of things, but they're basically in work but not being productive. And so presenteeism is something that is becoming much more recognised within organisations. It's very, very difficult to measure, but we know that when people are suffering from stress or poor well-being or poor health, that presenteeism can be a problem. And presenteeism actually accounts for, on average, 6.5 days lost productivity per employee per year, which is quite a considerable figure. And something else which I think is really important and often we don't necessarily think about is that when we're talking about health and well-being, organisations lose some really good talent because they don't care for their employees. And so the figures that we see are things like, 4 times more likely to lose talent within 12 months if as an organisation you don't promote health and well-being. And that also has an impact in terms of recruitment and retention costs. So all of these figures show us that actually poor well-being has lots of negative impacts on our businesses. And so what the health and safety executive have been doing is looking at putting the health back into health and safety. So we're aware that because health is quite intangible, the organisations found it much more easy to focus on the tangible, the physical things. And so it's much more easy for organisations to identify safety hazards. But it's actually possible to also identify hazards or risks to health. And that's what's really being promoted in the new health and safety executive strategy for 2020, the Helping GB Work Well campaign, where they've got a particular strand of that, which is talking about putting the health back into health and safety, and specifically looking at work-related stress, as they call it. I will come on in a minute just to talk about my particular thoughts on the whole idea of work-related stress. But basically, if we try and treat health and well-being in the same way as we treat safety, then actually we won't be going far wrong in terms of understanding what we need to do and managing it. We manage safety by identifying and eliminating primary risks, and we can manage well-being in the same way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that during today's webinar. So just go back to the point that I talked about briefly earlier, and this whole issue of well-being sort of be stress really. And I'm not comfortable with the term managing stress, because actually if you think about it, stress is a lagging indicator. So stress is actually a key indicator that something's gone wrong. It's an indicator of failure or absence of an effective well-being strategy. And so if you think about it, stress is really to well-being what accidents are to safety. And we don't generally talk about managing accidents. So I don't see why we talk about managing stress, because actually we're talking about managing a lagging indicator rather than proactively looking at what we can do to look at the positives. So I do have an issue with this whole idea of managing stress, and that's why I tend to use the word creating well-being, which I'll go on to explain a little bit more shortly. The other sort of issue that I also wanted to talk about was this whole idea of work-related stress. And I know HSE particularly talk about work-related stress, and some organisations do too. But if we think about what stress is, then actually we can see that it's impossible for there to be something called work-related stress. So stress is the adverse reaction that people feel when they perceive that the demands being placed upon them are too high. So firstly, it's about perception, which can be difficult because we can all have different amounts of pressure before we feel stressed. So what makes me feel stressed probably won't make some of you feel stressed, and other things, will be the opposite. So it is very much stress is in the eye of the beholder, as it were. But also we need to take into account the fact that stress is always bad. So we shouldn't really be talking about positive stress and some stress being good for you. So pressure's good for you, some pressure's good for you. Once it becomes excessive, then it turns into stress, and stress is always negative. So if we know that stress is actually the perceived pressures that are placed upon me, those come from not just work, but also from outside work. So if somebody is suffering from stress, then it's unlikely to be purely work related. It will be a combination of what's going on at work and at home. So I'm not comfortable with using the term work-related stress. I don't see that work-related stress exists in its own right, but there are certainly work-related stressors within our environment. And those stressors could be anything. So they could be people, they could be systems and procedures, they could be the work environment. Basically, those work-related stressors are anything that exists in our workplace which puts pressure on us and has the potential to cause stress. So I tend to use the word creating well-being rather than managing stress, because of this whole idea of stress being negative, having negative connotations. And I do believe that actually if we proactively manage stress in our organisations, then what we're doing is creating well-being, and we're enhancing quality of working life. And there's been quite a lot of research looking at how we can create well-being within organisations, and also research looking at quality of working life, which also includes things like job satisfaction. So if we go back to think about what well-being really is, then it's actually about feeling good and functioning well. And one of the things that we've come to understand more recently is that well-being underpins employee engagement. So one of the reasons why many employee engagement interventions don't work is because actually they're not underpinned by a sense of well-being. So we can put in place things that help us engage with our workers, but unless they actually feel cared for and valued by the organisation, then that engagement strategy won't particularly work. So we need to look at well-being and engagement as being sort of inextricably linked. We also know from research that well-being does lead to reduced accidents and improved business performance. And often when health and safety professionals feel that maybe well-being is straying into an area that isn't part of their role, it very much is part of a health and safety professional's role, because we can demonstrate that where we have poor well-being, we are much more likely to have accidents. And conversely, when we actually look at well-being and care about our people and look at what stressors exist within our work environment and address those, we actually get a reduction in accidents to accompany that. So as well as well-being helping a business to competitive advantage, it also stimulates innovation and growth. So we know that people who are feeling good and functioning well innovate, and obviously all organisations in the current economic climate need to have people innovating and need to be innovative in terms of what they're producing or designing. So some of the research that underpins the statements that I've just made was done by a movement called Engage for Success, which is part of a government think tank, which was set up to look at this whole idea of well-being and engagement being linked. And that's shown in this hard girling model here, which is actually a business improvement model. But what it clearly shows is that well-being or caring for our staff does underpin engagement, but that leadership is also key. So leadership impacts upon both engagement and well-being. And by leadership, I'm basically talking about emotionally intelligent leaders. So people who have that ability to understand and empathise with other people, and who understand the impact that their own leadership style has on their team and the people around them. And we do have a lot of issues with leadership in terms of well-being. So just as many organisations have invested in safety leadership training, there's also a need to look at equipping our leaders with better skills to enable the organization to feel cared for and therefore to engage better with them. So there's currently lots of work looking at exactly what we can do to bring that level of leadership to where we need it to be. And it's not really an issue in the sense that it's not a problem with individual managers and leaders. It's just the way that we've promoted people. We've traditionally promoted people based on their technical ability to do a job. So I'm a good engineer, so I get promoted to being a supervisor, and then I'm promoted to be the manager. And I might be a very, very good engineer, but I might not actually be a very good leader. I might not have those leadership skills. And often organisations fail to train me to actually be able to lead people and to be emotionally intelligent. So we need to look at what we can do to support our leadership more in terms of being able to move further with well-being and engagement. So what the Engage for Success movement did is look at what some of the key drivers of wellbeing are within organisations, and the key wellbeing drivers are on this slide. And what they found was that actually it's really important for people to have meaning and purpose to their role within an organisation. So they need to understand what the meaning of their role is, how valuable it is, and also how it contributes to the business overall. We often talk about having well-designed jobs and environments, and many organisations think about sort of human factors in many different ways. But particularly with wellbeing, it's not just about the actual physical work environment. It's also about things like shift work, fatigue management, long hours cultures. Leadership would come into there as well. So there's a lot more to looking at a well-designed job and environment than the traditional human factors and ergonomics that we might look at. Another important wellbeing driver is also control and autonomy. And this one differs a lot for different people. So some people like to have a lot of control over the pace of the work and the type of work that they do. Other people require less control. But what we do know is that we need a role that fits with how we like to operate. And so it's important that we recruit people into the right roles where the level of control and autonomy sits right with the individual who's doing that role. And then finally, the role of support relationships within work environments is really important. So this is relationship with your team, relationships with colleagues, relationships with managers and other leaders within the organisation. And so it's important to also look at that. So in a sense, if we go back to thinking about workplace stressors, then these are the potential areas where we could have workplace stressors. And so as part of any initiative, we want to look at whether there are any stressors that fit into these categories. And for anybody who's already looked at sort of stress risk assessments, that type of thing, you may have gone on the HSC website and looked at the management standards approach. And what you'll see is that there are 6 stressors that they talk about actually map quite well onto the 8 that I've just talked about. So there is generally quite a lot of agreement among various different professionals in this area as to what it is that we need to be looking at when we're trying to assess for the risks to wellbeing within our organisations. So we really do need to think more about all of these job factors and all of these wellbeing drivers, and we also need to really home in on how emotionally intelligent our leaders are and what we can do to enhance that. So if we're talking about creating wellbeing, or even if you prefer to use the term managing stress, then actually it's a fairly simple 3-step process to do that. And we start by assessing the risk. And I said earlier that if we manage health and wellbeing in the same way as we do stress, as we do safety, then actually we'll be on the right track. And this is exactly what we do for safety. We assess the risk first. We look at where the risks are to safety within an organisation, and we can do the same for where the risks are to health and wellbeing. And once we've been able to assess those risks or find where those stressors lie, then we can identify what the root cause of those issues are, and we can then look to implement some sort of intervention, ideally to eliminate the risk, or if not, to reduce or manage the risk in the best way that we can. So it is possible to manage the risk to wellbeing or create wellbeing by using the same basic tools as we use for safety. So what I'm proposing really is that rather than looking at wellbeing as the bikes and the bananas, that we actually start to take a more strategic, integrated approach where we look at wellbeing and engagement from the individual and organisational level. And when we start to think about wellbeing in this way, then we can actually sustain that, so we can enable sustainable wellbeing and engagement, and therefore sustainable business performance. So one way in which organisations can start to think about wellbeing is to go back to basics really, and think about, well, where are we now? Because actually, if you don't know where your current wellbeing culture is, it's very difficult to know where to go next. And so just as with safety, we do safety culture assessments or safety climate assessments, we can do wellbeing culture assessments. That will give a benchmark either across sites or between organisations or in different countries, so we can benchmark at any level. And once you know where you are, then you can decide where you'd like to be and put in place a roadmap that enables you to get there. And that means that rather than just throwing all sorts of weird and wonderful interventions under the label of well-being at people, we can actually start to look at, well, what interventions will actually target the root cause of the poor well-being, or what interventions will actually tackle the stressors that exist within our work environment. And when we can do that, then actually we're affecting many more people within the organisation than we can do by taking this more individual approach and expecting every person to be responsible purely for their own well-being. So it's taking the two and looking at the organisation and also looking at the individual. And so to help organisations in this sort of quest to look at well-being in a different way, I put together a model which is a wellbeing culture maturity model. So we have them for safety, and we can also have them for well-being. And what we know is that wellbeing culture is generally much less advanced or mature than safety culture. So whereas safety culture is generally now at the level of compliance and moving into sort of proactivity, then that's not really the case with well-being yet. So with well-being, we still have many organisations at this ad hoc level where well-being either isn't really being considered at all, or it's just occasional one-off health promotion activities. So, you know, it's National Stop Smoking Day, so we'll run a stop smoking campaign. So nothing wrong with any of those activities at all, but it's not part of a strategic approach. They're very much just ad hoc activities. Where we find the majority of organisations currently lies at what we would call the individual focused level, and this is where there are plenty of wellbeing initiatives, but they are all looking at sort of individual restorative interventions. So it is all of the bites and the bananas and the stress management and the yoga and health promotion activities. So it's lots and lots of separate interventions designed to help individuals become more resilient, basically. But it's not looking at what the root causes of any of the problems within the organisation are. So this is where most organisations seem to lie at the moment, and some are actually moving into what we call individual obsession, which is on the far right of that box, where there's just this constant flow of these individual interventions with no actual evaluation of them, so no evaluation of the impact or effectiveness of them, but it's just this whole idea of the more interventions we provide, then the better we are doing as an organisation in terms of managing stress or creating well-being. And obviously this isn't the approach that I would advocate. One of the positive things that's happened as a result of HSE starting to look more at this whole health area and talking about stress risk assessments and the management standards is that some organisations are now moving towards a risk management approach to well-being and making sure that they have done stress risk assessments and that they're able to satisfy sort of health and safety legislation. And that's a really good place to be, but there's a danger again of moving far over to the right into compliance obsession, which is where we've got with safety, where there's now so many systems and procedures, so much paperwork, lots of box ticking, people signing to say they've read things and they understand things. So very, very obsessive culture in terms of paperwork. And obviously we don't want to get to that point with wellbeing, because actually we can choose to take the path up to the next level, really, which is this creating wellbeing. And that's creating wellbeing through employee participation and ownership. It's a win-win for employees and for the organisation. So we're doing things to help our employees become more resilient, but we're also as an organisation looking at what we're doing to our employees. So what is it about working for this organisation which is stressful, or what are the stressors that exist within our organisation? And then it's tackling those at root cause. And so it's this level that we're trying to get organisations to move towards, and we can start from any of those earlier levels and put in place interventions which will take us to that level of employee engagement and well-being. And the ultimate level is what we call fully resilient. It's where we've got resilient people in resilient organisations. We've got a sustainable business on all fronts. And it's an aspiration for most organisations, but just as we have an aspirational goal to be, have 0 incidents or accidents, then it's really good to have that goal or that aspiration of becoming a fully resilient organisation in the future. And so this model is really useful in terms of helping organisations to benchmark where they are and where they'd like to be. And as I say, there is a roadmap that sits behind this of what interventions will help to move through those levels. So, despite the fact that everybody knows that companies that promote and protect the people are the most successful and competitive in the world, we still aren't really looking at well-being in the right way, and we're still very much being reactive. And so, although taking care of our people is the right, smart and legal thing to do, too many organisations still haven't really taken on board that message. So I'd like to call on organisations to start to do that, to start to think about well-being in a different way and think about how they can create well-being within their organisations. So thank you for listening. That was a very quick run through the wellbeing field. If you'd like to ask any questions, then I will respond to them now if we have time. If not, then I'll respond to them at a later date. And you obviously got my contact details. If you would like to email me, call me or anything else, then I'm always happy to help. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was a really well delivered presentation, actually, with a lot of good topics and thoughts and ideas for us to kind of think about. As mentioned before the webinar started, obviously the September webinar will be James Dodds from EnviroWater on the changes to licensing requirements on water abstraction. There are some key deadline dates coming up that affect everybody, so they want to make sure that everybody is fully understanding what the impact potentially might be. So please do join us for that. And then that will be followed by Clive Mitchell from the British Geological Survey. Please register for upcoming webinars and any IQ events on the IQ events page on the website. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.